Hello, and welcome to Humanitarian Interventions in Situations of Urban Violence. A few minutes late, I apologize for that, which is the sixth in a series of webinars on themes related to urban humanitarian response. This webinar is brought to you from the ALNAP Secretariat offices, which is near the banks of the River Thames in London. London being, as Joseph Conrad reminds us, one of the dark places of the earth. But it is hundreds of years, luckily, since the streets of London have witnessed armed conflict. Other cities have not been so lucky. There's a long history of the international humanitarian system engaging in many cities as diverse as Wambo, Jaffna and Beirut, all of which were involved in wars or civil wars. And this tradition continues, sadly, to the present day, not least in Syria. In addition to this, more recently, humanitarians have become increasingly aware of a different kind of armed conflict. Broadly, a conflict between what are often thought of as criminal gangs, and between these gangs and between each other, and also between these gangs and armed elements of the state. And while these are not always humanitarian situations under international law, the violence that's created and that's endemic in these contexts creates, of course, humanitarian situations or suffering, human suffering in and of itself. And it also creates an incredibly complex and difficult context for humanitarian agencies to work in, a very difficult background to work against. The continuing engagement in cities in war and the new trends or at least newly understood trends in urban violence raises a lot of questions for us as humanitarians. One that comes up a lot is whether this context is really any different, whether good humanitarian work in the context of urban violence is really different from good humanitarian work anywhere else, or for any other good urban work or other work in situations of violence. And as a part answer to some of these questions, we asked Elena Lucci to look into the issue, the humanitarian literature, predominantly literature from operational agencies themselves, and to try and come up with lessons around humanitarian response that are specifically applicable to working in contexts of urban violence. And we're absolutely delighted that Elena has agreed to present these lessons in this webinar today. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She studied international relations, for those of you who don't know her already, human rights and humanitarian aid, and from 2000 to 2004 she worked at the International Committee of the Red Cross as a protection delegate and subsequently as head of sub-delegation in Colombia, Rwanda and South Sudan. She later worked as a humanitarian affairs specialist with Médecins Sans Frontières, designing and implementing policies and advocacy strategies on several humanitarian issues in a number of countries. Currently, she conducts research and policy analysis on a various broad area of issues, present challenges to the principles of humanitarian action, children and violence, forced migration, and minimum protection standards. And she's been specializing in urban settings and urban violence and has published several papers on these topics. I'm also delighted to welcome Kevin Savage, who many of you I'm sure will know. Kevin is the research coordinator for the Humanitarian Office of World Vision International, where he's been working to help lead humanitarian policy and strategy for World Vision. Over the last 2 years, he's led an internal study to review the organization's engagement with urban contexts, including urban violence. I think very few people have done as much to raise the profile of urban issues in the humanitarian world as Kevin, so we're delighted that he will join us as a panelist after this presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand the baton over to Eleanor to give us a presentation on your findings on humanitarian interventions in situations of urban violence. Over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, and thanks, Paul, for the introduction. As you said, through this research on lessons, we looked at emerging lessons drawn from humanitarian responses in violent urban settings, and we know that, of course, violence can take different forms, from interpersonal to criminal violence to gangs to urban warfare. And what we tried to do here was to really look at lessons that were broad enough to apply to most violent contexts. This paper is operationally oriented, and it contains mainly insights from humanitarian organizations. All the lessons are drawn from case studies and evaluations, and the material is all available on the website www.urbanresponse.org. A few warnings on this work. Actually, we found that there's limited information available on several issues, including women and violence, public communication, advocacy, monitoring and evaluations, for example. And those limitations are, of course, linked to the choice of responses, which are mainly humanitarian in our choice, and the sources. And because we mainly looked at humanitarian responses, this meant that, for example, peace building or addressing root causes of violence, IDPs and refugees, displaced urban settings, are outside the scope of this paper, as well as literature from other sources is also underrepresented. But let's go and see what is urban violence and why is it important for humanitarians. The literature, of course, points to the fact that urban areas create an enabling environment for violence, which poses distinct challenges to humanitarian response. Urban areas are dynamic, dense, there's a diversity of population, which means also diverse needs, both in specific neighborhoods and throughout the cities. And urban areas can contain increased deprivation and vulnerability. Also, the high population density means that more people are more likely to be affected, sometimes overwhelmingly by violence within a small space. There can be high homicide rates in low-income areas, loss of life, injuries, trauma, and so on. And there's, of course, widespread protection issues. Urban violence can also, for example, limit the mobility both of the populations that are affected by violence and of aid actors. Mobility can mean, restrictions of movement due to insecurity, front lines, the need to negotiate access with different actors in localized areas. And of course, urban violence can limit the access to basic goods and services, like health services, social services, physical protection, legal services, and so on. Urban violence can put additional strain on existing resources, for example, due to the increase of vulnerable and displaced people needing attention and assistance, and it can create a vicious cycle of suffering and vulnerability, therefore eroding possibility for collective action and resilience. Urban violence itself is dynamic, heterogeneous, simultaneous, and interactive, which means that it can have effects that can influence one another. In the paper, people will find that there are lessons that are common and transversal lessons, and other kind of lessons that are more sector specific. And today we will address mainly the transversal lessons. So the first ones really are about the strategy definition, the intervention strategy definition. And they mainly really depend on the characteristic of urban violence and its consequences. One key one, for example, the first one is because of the blurred boundaries often between humanitarian and developmental assistance in such settings, there are in urban violence settings we have chronic needs coexisting with acute needs, and therefore it is very important that humanitarian organizations ensure the clear aims of their intervention, and they need to be clear about what are the triggers for action, the objectives, the scope, and the orientations of their intervention. Be aware of their limitations, and also answer questions like what kind of violence do they want to respond to. This also links to the capacity which needs to be ensured in terms of organizational commitment, such as logistics, finance, skilled human resources, and so on. Again, because of urban violence, characteristic. There's a concentration of violence and conflict often in specific areas, and therefore it's very important to understand that humanitarian needs can depend on very localized conditions. This means that a localized approach is often necessary in terms of humanitarian interventions, together with the need to work with authorities at all levels. But because of the fact that the violence is dynamic, there's also need to be vigilant on the whole city, and because violence can move across neighbors, of course. We have in urban settings, of course, there are fragmented and vulnerable communities, multiple, dispersed with different needs, and therefore it's very important to also act strategically to develop their capacity, strengthening existing skills of individuals and structures at community level, capacity building, trainings, facilitating contacts between communities and the service providers, and so on. Humanitarian response itself may impact on or increase violence, and therefore it's very important that humanitarian organizations keep a do no harm approach, so at the very least they should prevent violence from occurring as a result of their action. For example, do not put beneficiaries at risk during relief distributions. And also the fact that changing dynamics within a city affected by violence requires a lot of time. It is important that organizations consider a long-term approach. In that the short-term planning can also, provides a limited vision and instability of projects. And here it's very important, in fact, that organizations consider more of a longer-term presence in this sort of settings. But this is also a point to be considered in that urban violence may persist, but humanitarian aid cannot be delivered continuously. And therefore, it's very important that organizations plan their exit strategy from the beginning. They identified their exit points and clearly defined outcomes. Because, again, of the fact that urban contexts are complex and changing, there's a need to respond to changing circumstances as well, and therefore interventions need to be flexible and adaptable, and mainly based on a learning approach, open to the possibility that programs can change over time. We saw one of the key lessons in terms of skills and human resources is really that these sort of settings require specialized skills that can go from specialists like outreach teams, social workers, lawyers, anthropologists, as well as urban planning experts, technical and urban government expertise, and so on. Together with the importance of the credibility and caliber of staff working in such settings. A number of lessons pertain also to the field of partnerships and relationships, which seems to be a key issue to consider in urban settings, in violent urban settings. Particularly, what is important is what seems important from the lessons is to include outreach activities in the project strategy in order to increase access to services. For example, of course, letting people know about available services, providing them with useful information, and having outreach workers that can can refer to services, provide information, as well as gather information on violence or marginalized community members so that the organization can act upon. And another important issue is the coordination with other service providers in order to improve effectiveness and operational reach. When we mention coordination, we refer to first and foremost affected communities, as well as local and municipal authorities, other humanitarian developmental organizations, the private sector, the academia, and religious organizations. Because of the scale of needs, of course, coordination is very important. And it's very important in terms of, for example, context analysis, advocacy efforts, security awareness and management, provision of complementary services, planning of exit strategies through partners. And then, of course, there's an issue of how to choose the partners, because this needs to be done very carefully, in that humanitarian organizations particularly need to maintain neutrality in violent context, and therefore they need to be aware of the partner's political agenda, particularly when the government is part of the conflict. There's an issue of trust on the part of the community, and also local volunteers might find it difficult to maintain neutrality. So it's very important to also use conflict mapping tools to make sure that we know who the partners are, or potential partners. In terms of relationship, the issue, a very important issue with the engagement with armed actors. Engagement is very important and needs to be done carefully, of course, because anyway, any work that is happening in any neighborhood under the control of a non-state actor is subject to the discussion or the authorization by gangs or non-state actors, and therefore this sort of engagement is very useful for running and establishing operations, ensuring the security of operation, accessing people in need, and making sure that also the population can access the services provided. Engagement is also very important for protection dialogue and for acceptance strategies. So definitely need of engaging with armed actors, but of course this needs to be done very carefully. There's another set of lessons linked to analysis, assessment, and targeting, which seems to be really one of the key issues in terms of understanding needs and defining then the intervention afterwards. Because we discussed already the city's dynamism, the high levels of mobility, as well as the reliance on markets and logistic hubs, and this could be disrupted by violence. So there's a need for different assessment and responses. Complexities of urban violence, so who are the actors involved, who is who, what are different forms of violence, for example, social, political, ethnic, religious, criminal, and so on. Who are the targets of violence, what is the geographical control of the different groups, the resources and support that they have, and so on. But we also, within the assessment and the analysis, the context analysis, it's also important to understand what are the specific problems that are affecting the population, what are the groups at risk, the vulnerabilities, the direct and indirect effects of violence, linked to access to services, and so on. And also, because of the, as we said, of the immense size and complex structure, it's very important that humanitarian organizations in their assessment consider what existing institutions and services are available and their accessibility. This could include, of course, governmental services as well as private services, NGOs, and so on. There's also a point, however, that there's within our research, we didn't encounter appropriate and suitable existing assessment tools for urban context in violence settings, and they would be able to provide all this information. So, of course, these tools need to be developed still, and they should include and provide information, as we mentioned, on specific groups at risk, analysis of context, and so on. Also, in high-risk environments, we found that remotely managed assessments may be necessary. We saw many examples, for example, from Mogadishu or Aleppo, where also a need to assess the risks to the local staff or partners beforehand, and establish reporting systems, communication protocols, monitoring procedures, and train the staff in data collection and so on. Assessments, good assessments need to be planned in advance. This means that organizations need to be aware of the constraints of the settings that they're going to assess, and this could be linked to time, accessibility, security, limited geographic coverage, unclear figures, and so on. Assessment also needs to be repeated because situations can change rapidly, and what a first assessment the information provided by a first rapid assessment might be just a snapshot and might be different from the situation in the medium term. So it also means that assessment needs to be, as I said, repeated and systematic and regular. And in terms of methodology of assessments, it's very important, the literature shows that it's very important to use a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods and data triangulation. Another group of lessons really pertain to the security management of operations in violent urban settings. We saw that different security risks require humanitarians to adapt to the local context. For example, they need to consider dangers related to crowds, mobs, looting, crossfire, snipers, which are really specific to these settings. And of course need to be aware that the security situation can change extremely rapidly. This means also sometimes that the risks need to be assessed and managed almost by block analysis, and good management tools for security management include, of course, an analysis of threats and how to prevent them, a description of the neighborhoods, the routes that need to be taken to reach particular locations, day and night risks, and the contact details of security responsible within the community. This brings me to the point of the fact that the field level decision need to be ensured in a short time, and often given the volatility and context specificity of each neighborhood, the team closest to the field takes relevant security decisions and not the management that is, it might be far away from that team, so that the most current and relevant information is acted upon. And also the community needs to be involved and aware of security issues. That means that security also depends on the attitude of the communities that are affected by the conflict, and they need to be made aware of the consequences of potential security incidents, which often are in fact the suspension or stopping of the program. And the community needs to be well informed in order to reduce complaints, threats, and dangers. And they can also, the community and their leaders can also be involved in the daily site security assessment, for example. Very important also, it's all the staff that is involved in the relief staff from the organization need to have a proper security management training. First of all, security guidelines, procedures, and protocols need to be in place and updated regularly, but then the staff also needs security management workshop and briefings regularly, and make sure that they know how to react to specific dangers and threats. For example, how to react to, for example, gang members in panic or drugs, and how to avoid certain risks. So as I said, these were the sort of transversal and common lessons. The paper also contains lessons on protection, health, shelter, and livelihood. And as also, as I said at the beginning, we found that there's little or no published urban violence specific information on NFIs, communication strategies, gender issues, as well as sectors like education, food security, and water and sanitation. And therefore, there's definitely a need to increase the practice on one side, and the other side, the sharing of experiences with the broader humanitarian community. As a way of conclusion, I think the key points that we encountered with this research is that violence in urban settings may or may not meet the criteria for the application of international humanitarian law, but humanitarian consequences can be as serious. Humanitarians need to recognize the gravity of urban violence in its own right and better understand and engage with the causes and the impacts of urban violence and establish criteria for engagement in such situations, which are often still missing such criteria. And the paper definitely shows that lessons are emerging, but more practice is needed and experiences need to be shared in a wider manner. Thanks for your time.
Eleanor, thank you so much. Doing such a grand job in taking a paper which is really, there's a lot of detail in the paper and pulling out those key lessons for us. And I'm sure that many of the people on today's webinar will want to actually go and look in more detail at some of the kind of how some of these things have been achieved, which is there in the paper, or maybe to bring some of those up in questions now. If I could just remind everybody, on your screen you should have a little sort of panel on the right-hand side, and you can type in their messages, which we'll see here, and we can then put those to our panelists, to Eleanor and Kevin now. Those that we're not able to speak to today, we will continue in the urban community of practice, but we'll come on to that in a minute. Several of you were good enough to send in questions when you registered for this webinar, and I'd like to start actually with some of those questions because I think they're very pertinent and relate strongly to some of the things that Eleanor has said. So maybe I'll take the first one now and put it to you first, Eleanor, and then ask you, Kevin, to give your reflections on it. And this is a question about the issue that you brought up around international humanitarian law and many of these urban violent contexts not falling within the framework of IHL. So, Eleanor, our questioner asks, what are the challenges of working in a context which is not covered by international humanitarian law for a humanitarian organization? I wonder if you could share your experiences there.
Yeah, there's a key issues in terms of the legal framework in that in contexts covered by international humanitarian law, impartial humanitarian organizations clearly have the right to initiative and access to populations affected by the conflict and the right to provide assistance. This, in theory, should make negotiations with all the parties to the conflicts easier in order to establish a presence and provide assistance, because it is really written in the Geneva Conventions and also in the customary rules of international humanitarian law. And it gives somehow organizations a peace of mind on the legitimacy of their presence in certain contexts. However, in contexts that are not covered by international humanitarian law, humanitarian organizations can still offer their services, but they might encounter resistance to their operations. This resistance, the resistance to their presence is often linked to issues of state sovereignty and international reputation. You can imagine that for a country like Brazil, having humanitarian intervention, having a humanitarian organization willing to provide services to their population, it's a bit upsetting. And on the other hand, there's a poor and inexistent knowledge of humanitarian principles on the side of criminal groups or gangs. We need to remember that in non-IHL context, the key actors involved are generally non-state actors such as gangs, maras or narco-traffickers that are often engaging in confrontations with law enforcement agents for the control of the territory. And this happens in countries that are technically at peace. So the legal framework is definitely difference. This means that humanitarian organizations have little legal, if you want, negotiating power, but they rather need to work on acceptance strategies, dialogue and negotiations with all parties, be they from the government or armed groups. In terms of protection activities, there's also a difference in terms that although IHL doesn't apply here, human rights law always apply, as well as domestic criminal law. And in terms of carrying on protection-related activities, there are differences in different regulations on detention and use of force. But otherwise, I think protection activities can also be carried on under a human rights regime. I don't know if Kevin has something to add on this one.
That's great. I'd particularly like to pick out a couple of things there, because I think we'll probably come back to them. One, this idea that there is always a legal framework, and that human rights law is still providing a framework, and also the issue about acceptance and dialogue, which I think we'll come to in a minute. Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to speak. Eleanor gave us a very thorough overview of the issues there. So if you did have anything to add, please do. But I'd also like to ask another question as well. Did you want to add first to Eleanor's points there?
Sure, just a little. I think Eleanor highlighted probably the biggest. It's certainly the issue is about the relationship with the state, and I mean the affected state itself, and the ability for actors like humanitarians to their freedom and ability to engage with groups of people who are essentially enemies of the state. And I can, this is certainly for my own organization, particularly in Central America, Latin America. This is a big issue for us in that we are there our offices there are not just external offices. They are some of them are independent local offices of that country, and are. The violence that they're encountering is such that the people are they're not just criminals who maybe we could have the freedom to talk with or interact with simple criminals, but these are sort of super criminals, not recognized as legitimate or recognized belligerents within a conflict, but they're really just enemies. They are enemies of the state, and the people within the country are. Such as our organizations have a great difficulty talking to them, because they could themselves, or the organization itself, could end up in prison or be in real trouble with the state, because the people that they would engage with are being actively pursued by the state, and it's quite complicated for them to consider this. And then sort of externally, the second problem is that there's a lack of political ability external to the state for, say, international actors from outside to declare that they might be responding to or trying to raise money or declaring an emergency in this situation, because the politics are such that host state is not going to allow us to declare an emergency, which to them is a criminal internal matter. So. I think Eleanor covered it quite well, but it's certainly very practically for us, those two, sort of that external ability to say something is very difficult with the lack of IHL covering, and internally the same. It's not really possible for us to either identify a problem and declare it, and not possible for us to engage with those people, because it might land us all in jail. So Paul, you were going to explore some other issues there.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. And I think we'll come back, if we have time. I'd like us to come back to this issue of engaging and not landing up in jail. But before we do, question here, well, a couple of questions on similar themes. The first is how, and maybe Kevin, you could start with this one. How has your organization decided when to engage in a situation of urban violence? You know, what's, if you like, the trigger there? And what have you found to be effective entry points?
in this type of conversation, we need maybe we need to start teasing apart the differences between different places and different forms of urban violence in different settings. You've got up on the screen now Aleppo. Now you've got maybe on the one hand situations of urban violence that are coming under IHL and are actual well-recognized wars, which happen to be taking place in cities, and that is likely the future of warfare, and why I think it's so important for humanitarians to start engaging with this, because I think in future all of our work is going to be urban at some point in the not too distant future. And the other extreme, more what I was alluding to earlier, say in Latin American Caribbean urban violence that's endemic and which doesn't look like to some people classical warfare. We're a little different than some of the case studies that others have been looking at from ICRC or MSF in those cases where our organization is what some people call a multi-mandate, and we have offices and you know, we have partner organizations and elements of our partnership in countries in which we are there for decades. And one of the reasons we're particularly in those areas, what we're trying to do and what our mission or our goal is there is long-term transformational development, focus on children, and we have long-term development programs with communities. And in some cases, we've had to actually stop operations and retreat from areas with extreme violence because it's just become impossible for us to deliver and work in the way that we have been used to over decades. In this case, what we're trying to do is go back to those places because we've recognized that those are where the needs are most. And this is what we're grappling with now is a bit of a return. So in this case, there isn't, this is where much of the work that we're trying to do internally is it's not so much a succinct, salient crisis that occurs in the way that a conflict might suddenly flare up or a hurricane might occur. We are recognizing an endemic, long-running, and growing situation of violence, and we're starting to recognize what we're trying to grapple with, and the way we're framing is, do we have the diagnosis tools? Do we have the data we need to understand where the greatest needs are and whether there is a crisis that we need to respond to? But it's a bit of a mix for us in that we're there for a long-term multiple mandate, and that's really part of the issue we're grappling with, which is slightly different than the approach that some of the pilots that MSF and ICRC were taking, which was to go somewhere they hadn't been before, recognize a crisis, and say we're going to go intervene there with a purely humanitarian set of goals, and that's where we wonder about the exit strategy.
Kevin, on this issue of entry points, where you're finding yourselves re-engaging in urban areas where there's violence, you'd mentioned earlier on the issue of that this is for World Vision, this is part of a longer-term transformational development strategy taking place in this very violent context, and the children are an important element of that. Have you found any specific operational kind of entry points which have been successful, or which so far appear to be successful? I know there's been quite a lot of work, for example, that World Vision's done on child-friendly space, I think.
Yes. In fact, I guess, well, most of the biggest amount of work we've done in that respect has come from our resilience and risk analysis, which we're doing in a number of different urban settings around the world, but in Latin America, Caribbean area, we have been implementing a community resilience and risk program, our model, which in this case has come up with working with communities to identify what the biggest risks are, and then to take that risk approach to design or to support communities to engage with risk. And it's been challenged in some places because our conventional models have been more used to responding to risks that are from natural disasters. So the pilots we're doing in in South America have come up with discovered that communities are saying, well, the biggest risks are in fact from the endemic violence and the consequences thereof. Now, and that's led us into activities that are addressing those risks, which are starting to look at ways we can work with communities, with populations of youth and adolescents, to do programs that we're calling risk reduction, but are aimed at reducing the risk of people falling into patterns of violence that reach from the home all the way up to the nation. So it is it does not bear a lot of, it doesn't look like a lot of agencies might see as classical humanitarianism. It's this mix of multidisciplinary work that's sort of linking our development and relief and our peace building activities together under what we're calling community risk. I haven't got
very
more
interesting stuff,
on it,
Kevin.
that's bringing people together to look at it from a risk perspective.
And maybe we can ask if there is anything that that you've written on this approach. I mean, here what I'm hearing is that this, through this sort of community-led risk, communities identifying their own risks and identifying their own entry points is one way to go about this. And if there is anything that that you'd be able to share on that, we'd be very grateful, I think, to send it out through the urban community practice so that other people could learn from that experience. Eleanor, I wonder if I can put the question to you. I know that much of the work in that you drew on for the lessons paper was from MSF and the Red Cross. I wondered the sort of entry points, decision to engage, and the sort of entry points, particularly perhaps from a health perspective, which you'd seen as being successful when you were looking at the lessons paper.
Yeah, I think it's mainly stemming from a recognition that of the humanitarian consequences of violence. This is generally an entry point, but it's still very debated in most organizations, as Kevin was saying. It's very difficult to find a policy within different humanitarian organizations for criteria for engagement or thresholds established that would grant an intervention in a specific place, and also it's also again the debate within the organizations on what kind of violence do they want to respond to in the first place. In my experience, it's easier for an organization to respond to an upsurge of violence in a place where they are already, rather than taking the decision to go into a new country and start a program in response to urban violence, where it's not clear how the organization can provide relief or protection in this kind of environment. However, to come back to what Kevin was saying, I think there's interesting examples that go into the same direction of what Vision is doing, because some humanitarian organizations started to consider a more holistic approach, looking at not only addressing the consequences and the acute needs caused by violence, but also trying to prevent it and reducing its future risk as part of the response. This is what they usually call the comprehensive intervention model. And it has, of course, a longer-term approach. And then in general, the International Committee of the Red Cross, as well as the Red Cross movement, is trying this approach in several Latin American countries. It's interesting that most of the pilot projects are, in fact, in Central and Latin America. But as I said, there's no, that I know of, and I've been looking and doing my research for this paper, there's no existing policy on interventions in urban violence settings within different humanitarian organizations. It's not to be found yet.
And are there any particular sort of entry points or types of programs which agencies have been sort of able to use as a sort of first step into these contexts successfully? Is there anything that you've seen through the literature review as a kind of a good way to get a foothold in an urban violent context?
Yeah, I've seen examples of, for example, trying to enter in this context offering health services, basic health services in particularly low income and prone to violence neighborhoods, and from there also setting up, for example, emergency rooms or whatever for injured population injured, or responses to sexual violence seem to be somehow a key entry point in most of the Central American countries. And there's a lot of work that I've seen done with youth, again in terms of risk reduction as well. Yeah, in order to really at a certain point prevent youth to join gangs and therefore create more violence, and work done with street children or displaced children and their families and so on, particularly in Colombia, or again I remember Honduras, there's a few programs like that. So starting maybe with small, more acceptable, let's say from an external point of view, programs, and then really move more into the core of what the intervention is supposed to be about, which is the response to violence.
That's great, thank you. I mean, one thing that comes through for me for the paper, which I thought was really interesting, is the way that violence and that the perpetrators of violence in many of these contexts are indistinguishable from the rest of civil society. That often this violence is so woven into civil society that it's very difficult to sort of to put up a kind of firewall between combatants and non-combatants. What you have is a very dynamic society, and that this where violence is kind of completely shot through the fabric of the urban of the city, and that I think brings us onto the next question. I mean, it suggests that getting close to the sources of violence and the perpetrators of violence is in fact not particularly difficult, because they are there, and that these fairly limited, kind of quite small interventions in areas like health are a good way of an organization presenting its bona fides almost, and a good way of an organization building up trust with the community, which can then be exploited for more comprehensive humanitarian interventions. I wondered, Kevin, taking this idea, and it's come up in a couple of the questions we've had here, how do you'd mentioned earlier on the difficulties of dialogue and the difficulties of gaining acceptance. I wondered if I could turn that around on you for a second and ask, is there any strategies beyond just doing humanitarian work? Are there any other strategies that World Vision has found, or that you know of, that have worked in terms of building acceptance and establishing some form of dialogue with armed actors?
Yeah, I don't think I've got a lot to offer there to keep going on that, Paul. I think as I don't want to repeat myself, but yeah, most of the work that we're talking about is taking a very broad community risk approach, but it's still very much we ourselves are still learning and trying to capture that experience on the ground. We've got a couple of projects over the next 2 years that I hope are going to start to gather that information and knowledge and learning that we have from our they're not really pilots perhaps, but new attempts to go back to some of these areas. So I don't think, as Ellen has said, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of capturing examples and practice that has been successful. But it's that sort of community risk reduction and that, I guess, intervention with youth and with children, perhaps under an education engagement is where our work is going to go. But it's still early days in terms of collecting that learning. So there's not a particular
Thank you.
set.
We'd be very grateful as well for anyone who's listening in to post any ideas that they have or experiences that they have about this difficult issue of how to, on the one hand, the perpetrators of violence are everywhere and it is in the society and it's right next door, but on the other hand, how do you meaningfully engage, particularly around difficult issues such as protection, with non-state actors when you're working outside the framework of international humanitarian law? So any experiences from the community that people who are listening in would like to share, we would be very happy to publicize and share across the network. I don't know, Eleanor, if you, in looking at the paper, I know there were a few ideas that had come up from engagements, Red Cross engagements and MSF engagements, I think, in terms of how these agencies in particular had gone about entering into some form of dialogue, some form of protection dialogue and broader dialogue with armed actors. I wonder if there was anything you could share with us there.
Sure. There are examples in terms of starting with acceptance strategies. Most organizations, they look into, for example, in order to gain acceptance, gradually trying to start by meeting people's needs through some sort of visible assistance and make the organization better known in the community, for example, by providing first aid or water sanitation, education or health services and so on. And this work needs to go hand in hand really with discussing with the community on what are their needs. And at a certain point, I've seen from different examples that after first discussions with the community, there's always someone who is able to make a link with some actors within the community that might be part of an armed group or a gang leader, so that discussions can continue on what is the organization all about, for example, what's its purpose, what are the objectives of the presence in a particular area. And this can lead, of course, then to, once the organization is better known, there might be even direct meetings with the leaders of these non-state actors. And this is very important because it would lead then to be able to move freely within a particular neighborhood that might be controlled by one of the gangs. And also it might lead, of course, to, it should lead, of course, to better access for the people in need, and also to some sort of basic protection dialogue, which with these sort of actors, of course, it can only be a bit minimalistic in a way that they don't have somehow political goals, but rather they have more of an interest in maintaining the support by the community and strengthen their ties with the community. So, for example, a protection dialogue with this sort of groups might just be looking at protection of medical facilities or infrastructure which is vital to the community, and that for which the gang or the armed group itself sees an interest. But yet there are acceptance strategies, of course, and it's all about making sure that the organization is able to offer something that is of interest, first of all to the community, and then to these armed groups as well. And then from there, there's a gradual involvement and dialogue.
Great, thank you very much, Eleanor. And it brings me back to one thing that stood out for me in the paper, where you say that any work carried out by humanitarian players in a city neighborhood that's controlled by a gang or armed forces will be subject to discussion and authorization by that gang, whether one is aware of it or not. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting and important point for us all to consider. There are many other questions that have come in, questions about early warning systems for violence, questions about the relationship between employment and urban violence, questions about the correlative to the entry point, but how do we know when to leave, questions about holistic programming, and questions about sectoral as opposed to area rather than opposed to sectoral coordination. All fascinating questions which I hope, if we do not have time to address today, we will post into the community of practice, and so we can keep this this conversation going. I'm seeing my colleagues around the table are nodding, so I think that's agreement. I'd like to finish today with the last question, Kevin, which is you said that the World Vision is already working on some good practice examples, but what do you think are the big questions that still need to be answered, and where is there a need for more good practice examples? Perhaps you could just give us your top two, if you would.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, you asked about the sort of biggest thing. I mean, maybe less so the best. Well, there's quite a difference. There's some practice in both practice and policy, both of which are really, really big issues. And I'd like to come back to something I was pointing out earlier with respect to bridging and bringing together different mandates and different ways of working and maybe operational ways of thinking. OCHA is about to release an interesting policy research discussion about seeing and measuring and thinking about humanitarian intervention from a risk perspective that's a bit of a call for bringing development and humanitarian actors together to deal with some of the places in the world which don't fit and don't work when we see things through a very narrow mandate of development and relief. And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems here, and one of the reasons you've got ECHO's humanitarian call last year looking at how do we diagnose and look at the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean as a humanitarian problem. But I think the starting point for that is problematic because of these narrow mandates that need to be brought together to address this. And a lot of I think maybe the biggest practice area that we need to look at is how we deal with the very analysis and the heterogeneous way that these forms of violence occur and manifest themselves in different places, because it's not homogeneous, and the issues and the way that violence is occurring in different places is really quite different. And unfortunately, it calls for a really good ability to analyze at the ground level in very specific cases what's going on and how to engage with it, because it is very different between Mogadishu or Medellin, and you've got to have the ability to gather data and engage and analyze on the ground.
Thank you, Kevin, and some sort of entry-level questions, if you like, for some of this contextual analysis and assessment are included in the paper. We'd be very grateful, again, if anyone listening here has other tools which have proved successful in understanding contexts, urban violent contexts, which they were prepared to share with the community of practice. Eleanor, maybe I could give you the last word on the last question. What lessons, having now compiled the paper and gone through the literature, what lessons do you think still need to be learned? What would your top two be?
Well, besides echoing what Kevin was saying, I think in addition to that, there's again the big questions on how to conduct assessments and the need to produce adapted tools for assessment and analysis in this sort of context. And big question how to monitor and evaluate these kind of interventions. There's absolutely no guidance on it. And again, how to conduct also more holistic, integrated interventions. How can we operate in a continuum from development to relief to environment building somehow. There would be a lot of lessons really on the list here, but I don't want to overburden you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. We hear certainly the lesson here at ALNAP and the ALNAP network. We hear the lesson about M&E, and we'll pass that on to our colleagues who are working on the evaluation of humanitarian action guide, and see whether they have any thoughts for us. For now, I would like to very much thank you, Eleanor, for the paper, which is a great contribution, and for agreeing to present it today. Kevin, also I'd like to thank you for taking part and for your very thoughtful responses based on World Vision experience in these contexts. I'd like to thank the ALNAP team here who've been working on these issues of urban issues in general, and who are getting ready now to produce a little plug here, everybody, but who are putting together a panel on accountability, engagement, and the city for the ALNAP annual meeting, which, as many of you know, will be taking place in Addis Ababa in March. So anyone interested in that, please go to the website. And most of all, I'd like to thank all of you who've taken the time out this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, to take part in this webinar. I'm very sorry, again, we didn't get to all of the questions. We will try and put these questions out into the webinar, into the listserv, and please, if you have any questions you want to put to the listserv or any answers for any of the questions that have come up, we'd very much like to hear from you. For those of you who would like the paper in Spanish, the Spanish paper is available on the ALNAP website as of today, and the recording of this webinar will also be going on the ALNAP website as well as on www.urban-response.org, the Urban Humanitarian Response website. So thank you very much. I wish you and your colleagues who are working on these issues a very productive and safe new year, and we look forward to you joining us for the next Urban webinar.